Be the reason someone smiles. Give a smile, give a smile. Give a smile, give a smile. Give a smile, give a smile. Be the reason someone smiles. Simba, gedola, lio, lio, simba. Simba, gedola, lio, lio, simba. Simba, gedola, lio, lio, simba. Simba, gedola, lio, simba. Give us my soul, give us my soul, give us my soul, give us smile. Give us my soul, give us my soul. Be the reason someone smile. Give us my soul, give us my soul, give us my soul, give us smile. Give us my soul, give us my soul. Be the reason someone smile. Simba, gedola, lio, lio, simba. Simba, gedola, lio, lio, simba. Simba, gedola, lio, lio, simba. Simba, gedola, lio, simba. Simba, gedola, lio, 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 simba.
Good evening. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? That was Barry Weber singing Give a Smile, Be the Reason That Someone Else Smiles. What a beautiful thought. Let's light up the darkness. Who's with us this fine evening? Let me see. Stephen Giger with us from Dover, New Hampshire. Brandon Christian Sullivan from Knoxville. Melissa Itel-Jurin from Great Neck. James Roth in the house from Indianapolis. Nancy Brandemel Wright in Southern Pines, North Carolina. Praying for those in the path of the storm. Yes, we are. May everybody be spared. We should only hear good news that everyone is okay. Likewise, everyone in the path of the fires in California. May we only hear good news. John Shore says, what's up from Sedona? Lucy Ram Johnson says, shalom from sultry Minneapolis. Before I go any further, Lucy, thank you very much. Lucy is sponsoring, dedicating our class tonight and a shofar blast to the memory of Chris David Ram. May his memory always be for a blessing. May his soul have a great aliyah, a great elevation. We are in Elul. It's still daytime over here. So here's a shofar blast for everybody, the wake-up call as we prepare for Rosh Hashanah. We blow the shofar every day this month. I hope that didn't blow out the speakers too much, or our microphone. Okay, thank you, Lucy. Thank you so much for contributing to our nonprofit and dedicating the class tonight. Varun Goda says, hello, bud. Gwen Strong says, happy Tuesday evening. Alma Espinoza from Colorado Springs is with us. Stephanie Marie Diaz, Aleichem Shalom. Donna Smith with us from Bahama, North Carolina. Celeste Geddes from Elyria, Ohio. Sodfa Sophie says, hello from Egypt. Welcome. So great that you're with us. Michal Galazan Corman. Michal from Southfield, Michigan. Jeff Abramson from Iowa. Varun is with us from India. So beautiful. We're spanning continents. Patrice Carter says, shalom. Salsa Canedo was with us from Pasadena, Texas. Arnold Alban is with us. Alice Burston says, shalom. Patrice is with us from St. George. Karen Mello Greer from Melbourne Beach, Florida. And Annie McGregor is with us from Michigan. Over on the YouTube side, Neil is with us from Virginia. Vaughn Billow from Fremont, Ohio. Maggie Scott from Ohio, also in Ostrander. Lynn is with us from North Texas. And very good. Okay, my friends. Here we go. Let's get into it. Where are we? So we are on tractate Eruvin, page 16. By the way, the numbering is a little funny in Hebrew. It should be Yud Vav, right? Yud is 10, Vav is 6. But for 16, we don't say Yud Vav because Yud and Vav are two of the letters of God's name. For the same reason, for 15, we don't say Yud followed by Hey. Instead, we say, for today, we say Tes Zion. Yesterday, we would have said Tes Vav. 9 and 6, 9 and 7. So we don't use letters of God's name just for numbering purposes. At any rate, we're on Daf 16, Tes Zion. We are in chapter 1. We are completing Mishnah number 6, our discussion of Mishnah number 6, and opening Mishnah number 7. Yesterday, we started looking at the rules of an enclosure for the purposes of Shabbos carrying, based on a temporary enclosure made when a caravan is traveling, right? So in the ancient world, you can imagine a bunch of people traveling on camels through the wilderness. It's Shabbos. They're going to make some kind of an encampment. They want to be able to carry within the encampment so they can go from their tent, let's say, to their friend's tent. So they make an enclosure. And as we saw yesterday, you could make an enclosure out of the camels themselves, the camel saddles, the cargo, the gear, etc. And what are the rules of the enclosure? So far, what we've seen is it needs to be at least 10 tefachim high, 10 hand breadths high, and that the standing portions of this enclosure have to outnumber the breached portions, right? So the gaps between the stuff that makes up the fence of the enclosure. We saw that there was a dispute between Rav Pappa and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, on the question of what happens when the standing portions of that enclosure are exactly equal to the gaps, the breaches, right? We know that there needs to be more standing portion than gaps. What if the standing and the gaps are exactly equal? So here, I mean, it's a question that almost makes no sense. How could something be so precise when we're talking about, camel saddles and camels? I mean, if the camel just kind of leans his nose forward or back, it's going to change the exact measurement. So what we're really getting at here is what is the underlying principle? How are we going to decide this question philosophically speaking? And the rabbis are going to wrestle with this question for a lot of space on this daf. It's actually a very long daf in the Talmud, but we're not going to cover all of those intricacies for the purpose of our class, for our shiur. For now, we'll just note that the rabbis go in a lot of different directions. They look at the related laws of the roof of a sukkah. They look at kilayim, meaning diverse kinds growing in a field. We have to keep different species, different kinds of plants apart from each other. Classic example is grapevines in a vineyard have to be kept separate from wheat and barley. Those are very different kinds of crop, and they need to be kept separate. Sometimes it's a distance thing. Sometimes we create partitions between the crops in order to keep them separate. So those are just areas of law that the rabbis are going to look at as they're trying to figure out between Rav Pappa and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, what is the ruling. Rav Pappa said, if the partitions and the gaps are exactly equal, it's permitted to carry in that space. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, says we may not carry in such a space. So we're trying to figure out, are we gonna follow Rav Pappa or Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua? The discussion takes a momentary pause to mention a different kind of enclosure. That if you have stakes with a braid of straw across the top, now, so what have you got? I mean, just imagine it's, was there, there was a little figure. I don't think there's a figure over here in our illustrations of that idea, so I'm not gonna go there with these figures. But the idea was this: if you just have sticks and then a braid of straw. So what does that mean? In other words, straw, so like, dry grass is long dried grass is straw, like hay, like horses eat. And you're going to make a braid of it. So it's going to be a quite a weak rope, as it were, quite a weak, it's like a thick string, but it's made out of straw. So it could fall easily, but it'll stand. And you're going to connect stakes with this braid of straw to another stake and make an enclosure that way. This is a flimsy enclosure indeed. Certainly it's going to have more space than stuff, right? The stakes themselves, the poles, they're going to be pretty thin. The braid of straw across the tops of the poles, that's very thin. What kind of an enclosure is this? And the answer is, this is an effective enclosure. Why? Because you have stakes and the straw across the top to another stake. So in each location, what you have is the form of a doorway. If you have two side posts and a crossbeam, even though it's weak, in this case, we're not correcting an alley, so we're not going to be worried about this, that it has to hold up a brick, but it's creating the form of a doorway. So this is going to be a valid enclosure. And it makes sense to us because when we think about a community Eruv that allows carrying, within a city or within a large portion of a city, and it's usually made with posts, maybe posts that are attached to light posts or telephone posts, and then often fishing line across the top. How can that possibly operate to allow us to carry within it? Why? These thin sticks and fishing line across the top. And the answer is because in each section of that, we've got two posts and a crossbeam. That's the form of a doorway, and that's going to allow carrying within that. We continue this discussion, however, of the enclosure that we're making around the caravan. And ultimately, the analysis shows that Rav Pappa is wrong, that when the standing portions of the enclosure around the caravan equal the breached portions, we should not be allowed to carry there. It should only be when the standing portions exceed the breaches or the gaps. And yet, the tradition, the law, the halacha, follows Rav Pappa. Right? The end of the discussion of this Mishnah is we have made a conclusive refutation of Rav Pappa, and the law follows Rav Pappa. So what does that mean? And the Gemara even asks, the exact wording here, it's so nice the way they put it, is a conclusive refutation and the halacha? How is this possible, right? Because the way it was put, the Gemara concludes, indeed, it is a conclusive refutation. Nevertheless, the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rav Pappa. So this is definitely a nod to tradition. They did the full analysis. Everybody chimed in. It went for pages and pages. And at the end of the day, Rav Pappa is wrong. But by this time, the law is following Rav Pappa, so we're not going to go change it because it's become universal enough. And the way that the law was exactly worded in the Mishnah shows that the law needs to follow Rav Pappa. And that's where we leave it. We now come to Mishnah number 7. Again, we're dealing with a caravan. So a caravan is traveling through the wilderness, and they're going to stop, and it's going to be Shabbos, and they're trying to make an enclosure for all the people of the caravan so they can carry, going from their tent to their friend's tent within the enclosure. But this time, they brought along some supplies to make the enclosure. They're not just relying on the camels kneeling, the camel saddles, the cargo that they're unloading, etc. They actually brought along some sticks and ropes to make an enclosure. Now, the sticks are not that tall, so it's not going to be the form of a doorway, right, where it's going to be like just a tall, poles and line on top. They're going to make a temporary fence. It's going to be, the theory here is not going to be the form of a doorway. The theory here is that they're going to enclose this area, the temporary enclosure for Shabbos, using sticks and ropes to make a fence. They're creating a fence. It may be temporary, but it has the form and philosophy of a fence. Okay, so this fence needs to be at least 10 tefachim high, 10 handbreadths high. And now you're going to use these ropes. Now, the key is, as we've seen several times, we have one rule that the standing portion has to exceed the gaps, okay. But we also have a rule about loudmouthed that if something has less than 3 handbreadths space, we can connect it. But if it's more than 3 handbreadths of space between these two objects, we cannot make a legal connection between them. So what we have is a situation like this. This is the fence that they're going to create around the encampment where the caravan is parked in the wilderness for Shabbos. So that fence is going to be the 10 handbreadths high. They have the sticks and they have the rope. As you'll see in this figure, the rope is pretty thick. And the reason that they're going to make the rope thick is that they're going to say that the 3 ropes themselves add up to 1 handbreadth thick. In other words, each rope is about 1/3 of a handbreadth, right? So that kind of makes sense. It's a rope that's kind of like that and like that and like that, right? So a rope about that thick, definitely reasonable. And why is that important? Because it's 10 handbreadths high. You're going to have 3 ropes there, but the top rope has to be at the top of the stakes so that the fence is 10 handbreadths high. And so you're going to have 3 gaps, right? There's going to be 3 gaps there. And because of the thickness of the ropes there, each one is going to be just a shade under the 3 handbreadths. So there's no gap between the ropes that is larger than 3 handbreadths. This is going to be a kosher enclosure. The problem happens when you don't have ropes that are so thick. When the ropes are not so thick, you get to a situation where you're going to have a gap of 3 and then 3 and then 4, or you're going to have a gap of 4 and then 3 and then 3. And you're going to have this extra gap between the ropes that is going to create a problem. So how are we going to deal with that? They actually never resolve that question. How to space it out between the ropes. They argue sort of back and forth. Well, we should put the 4 tefachim gap in the middle, or we should put the 4 tefachim gap at the bottom. And they never really work it out. So we don't have a proper answer for where you should put that 4 tefachim gap. The question then becomes, okay, but we're creating this enclosure for our caravan, our temporary enclosure, while we're traveling. So the first question is, well, whatever rules we're going to learn out from this enclosure, are they going to apply at home, in town, when we're creating some kind of an enclosure or even a community eruv so that people can carry within it? Are we going to learn out rules from this communal enclosure that the caravan is using for its temporary purposes while on the road? Are these rules going to apply in the city at home? And there's going to be a disagreement about that. Rabbi Yehuda says the principles we're stating here are for the caravan on the road. This is exigent circumstances. We need to be a little bit more lenient. They have to be a way for them to carry within their enclosure. And there's only so much stuff that they can bring with them on these camels to create the enclosure when they're really in the business of hauling cargo from one place to another. The rabbis are going to say, no, the rules that we're going to apply in the situation of this caravan, these are just an example of general rules which do apply in the city. So this principle is going to come up quite a bit in our study of the Talmud, this question. Are we learning how to handle a specific situation and the rules that we come up with only apply to that situation? Or are we going to be able to extrapolate and generalize from that situation to many other situations? Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, adds a little wrinkle of his own. He says that when you're talking about some kind of an enclosure of a courtyard for Shabbos carrying, it has to have both vertical and horizontal elements. This thing with the sticks and the ropes would have that, vertical and horizontal elements. But if you only just stick sticks into the ground, and they're going to be, let's say, less than the 3 handbreadths apart, but it's just going to be a bunch of sticks in a row along the ground, that's different, right? That's going to be different. And according to Rabbi Yosef, that's not going to work. But the rabbis say, yeah, it works. It can be made of just vertical elements or just horizontal elements, as long as it satisfies the gaps and breaches and standing portions requirements that we're discussing here. It's going to be a valid enclosure. Okay, so now the question is, how big may this enclosure be? Now, this is very important because this is going to affect that ultimately. We know that there's community Eruvs that can be very large. LA has one of the largest in the world, if not the largest. It includes many, many square miles. So how is it that we're able to do that? Now let's go back in time to when the rabbis are figuring this out, and there were no massive community Eruvs like we have in Los Angeles, and they're trying to figure out, well, how big can an enclosure be where it's all going to be one private domain and people can carry within this enlarged private domain? How big can a private domain be? That's the question they're talking about here. We start with the example of the caravan. Rabbi Yehuda says, well, we're not going to learn out community Eruvs in a city from a caravan, but the rabbis say, yes, we are. Yes, we are. Okay, so how big may it be? Rabbi Yehuda says, well, when we're talking about temporary enclosures, unsteady mechitzos, unsteady fences, okay, so then the rule is it can enclose up to 2 beis. 2 beis. In other words, 2 square seahs. As we saw yesterday, this is an area of approximately 100 feet by 100 feet. What is 100 feet by 100 feet? What is that area? It's, I think it was 70 square amos, 70 square cubits. Where do we get this number? So it's very interesting. This is the amount of farmland you need to grow 2 measures of grain. Now, obviously, some land is more fertile than others. Some farmers are more skilled than others. Some people can produce more out of the same plot of land. But on average, to create these 2 measures of grain, you need about this much land, about 100 feet by 100 feet. Why is that? And it turns out, so why 2 measures and why this amount of land that produces 2 measures? What's so important about 2 measures? Actually, what it is that the courtyard of the tabernacle, when the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness, was 2 beis. In other words, it was the area, the courtyard of the tabernacle was large enough to produce 2 measures of grain. It was this size that we're talking about. So you get that mental picture, about 100 feet by 100 feet. If you're a metric type of person, about 30 meters by 30 meters. That's the size of the courtyard of the tabernacle. Okay, so according to Rabbi Yehuda, with these temporary enclosures, that's how much you can enclose and not more. Beyond that, it's not going to work. It can't be this private domain enclosure for carrying on Shabbos. But Rabbi Yehuda doesn't like us to even extrapolate back to town, as we saw. He says, okay, you can do this out in the wilderness, but in town, it's going to be different rules. Rabbi Yosef says, his son, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, he says, okay, 1 or 2 people, even in town, they can make an enclosure that is 2 beis. So this size, this 100 feet by 100 feet. But if you have 3 or more people who are going to join together to make an enclosure, so in other words, we're saying that 1 or 2 people can have a private property and they can make an enclosure about 100 feet by. But according to Rabbi Yosef, if you have 3 or more people, they assume the legal status of the caravan. So like you're thinking the caravan enclosure would, that's the exigent circumstances in the desert. That must be a smaller size than what we can do in town. But actually it's the opposite. He's saying 1 or 2 people, wherever they live, they can make, this 100 foot by 100 foot enclosure. But 3 people or more, they can make a bigger enclosure. Why? Because they have the legal status of a caravan, right? 2's company, 3's a caravan. And so now their limit is enlarged. How big is it? According to Rabbi Yosef, now you can go up to 6 beis, right? So the amount of land that could produce, 6 of these measures. So in other words, now it's, think of it more like a rectangle that's 300 feet by 100 feet. So the rabbis are going to disagree with both Rabbi Yosef and his father, Rabbi Yehuda. The rabbis say, okay, if an individual or a caravan, either way, the enclosure is going to be a courtyard that's big enough to fill their needs. But if this enclosure includes an area that is the 2 beis, the 100 foot by the 100 foot, which is actually unoccupied, that it is not used. In other words, they made their enclosure too big. They made it very large, and they included a part within it that nobody is using, that is overgrown, let's say that is vacant. For whatever reason, we haven't encountered the reasoning for this yet, so I'm not sure what the reasoning is. But if your big enclosure includes within it that enclosure that is 2 beis, and it is not enclosed within the enclosure, that's going to invalidate our whole enclosure. So I guess what they're saying is, don't overdo it. Don't make too big an enclosure. And if you do, you have to monitor what's going on inside. Perhaps the reason is because in this big enclosure, if you have a sub-enclosure that is still pretty large and it's overgrown, maybe it's going to have that feeling, maybe even legally be a Carmelis or, not be a private domain. So when you carried from the general part of your enclosure where people exist into this unoccupied part, somehow you'd be transferring from one domain to another, and that would be problematic, and so it invalidates the whole enclosure. So here comes Rav Nachman, and he says in the name of Rabbeinu Shmuel, so our Rabbi Shmuel, the great Shmuel, the Amora in Babylonia, and Rav Nachman says, okay, so the law is 1 or 2 people, they can make an enclosure for 2 beis. 3 or more, it's going to be like a caravan, and they can make 6 beis. That's their max. So then somebody challenges Rav Nachman. He says, whoa. You just said the law according to Rabbi Yosef. Are you abandoning the majority opinion of the rabbis in order to follow the law of Rabbi Yosef? As you can see, it's confusing to us. It was even confusing to the sages. These are not easy rules. So Rav Nachman apparently made a mistake. It wasn't that this was his opinion. He made a mistake. How do we know that he made a mistake? Because the next thing we learn, and I'll just read it to you, is that Rav Nachman then placed a speaker standing over him and taught. Now, they didn't have, speakers with woofers and subwoofers and tweeters behind them like a public address, a PA sound system. What does Rav Nachman mean when he placed a speaker over him? It means that he went to address a large group of people, and he brought a big mouth like me, some guy with big lungs and who's loud. My friend Claude and I in college actually had this job, that in the large dining hall where we used to eat in college, we were the loud guys. So when somebody who was a little bit more shy needed to make an announcement to the room, they would say it to us, and we would make the announcement to the whole room. And that's what Rav Nachman did. He brought somebody really loud, and he had this person repeat for him, "The matters that I stated before you are an error on my part. Indeed, this is what the rabbis said. With regard to an individual, the halacha provides him with an area of 2 beis. With regard to 2 individuals, the halacha provides them with an area of 2 beis. 3 individuals or more assume the legal status of a caravan, and the halacha provides them with as much space as they need to fill their needs." So he had made a mistake, and he got himself a big loud person to make sure everybody heard when he said, "I made a mistake. Rav Nachman made a mistake." but he made sure to announce to everyone that he made a mistake. Why was it so important to cop to his error? Because he was the authority in his community, and it was necessary that people understand exactly what the law is and how serious even their authority figures were about getting it right, so nobody else should come to make a mistake. We should be so fortunate that all our politicians are ready to stand up before the community, and when they make an error, they want everyone to know and make sure that everyone knows the error was made, this is the nature of the error, and this is what we're going to do in the future to make sure we don't make that error again. So that's how Rav Nachman handled it. And so even though once you have 3 or more combining, it can be as big as necessary, but if it's 6 beis or more, and it has within it this unoccupied area of 2 beis that isn't being used, that's going to invalidate that whole enclosure. Yeah, that's what I've got for us this evening. I think that a nice takeaway is just what I just said, that we should learn from Rav Nachman when we're dealing with complicated stuff in our lives and we make a mistake. Okay, so we made a mistake. We tell everybody around us we made a mistake. This is how we'd like to do better. I'm doing my best. And I before I teach this class, I always try to remember to pray that I won't make a mistake and lead people astray. I'm sure it'll happen sometimes, and I always try to correct myself when I find out that I am wrong. And so if you see me or hear me say something wrong, let me know, and I'll be quick to cop to the error. Okay, let me see if we have questions. I am not seeing. This is from today, right? No. Is that yesterday? Nina, I'm not sure. Are we talking about Eruvin 16, 825? Yes, okay, good. Okay, so Vaughn Billow says, what if the open or common area has multiple entries? Do all of them need to fall under all the categories of an entrance or just one of them? So it seems like we haven't studied this carefully yet. So now I'm not sure. But I mean, I know that I've seen, community Eruvs where large portions of it, like if you actually here in LA, if you drive up Western Avenue, I mean, it is there, you can really see it. Most people are not noticing it because it's just a fishing line way up high. But if you know what to look for, so you'll see there's light poles, the street lights, and then at the base of the light poles, there's going to be sort of like a rubber enclosure that the telephone company uses or the electric company uses to enclose wires. And so they'll take, something that looks like a wire, but there's no wire in it. And they'll attach that to the light pole and it'll go up a certain amount of the way. It doesn't have to go all the way to the top. And then there's the fishing line at the top, and it just gets repeated over and over and over again. So why is that working as a mechitzos, right? There's so little there. It must be because each section has the form of a doorway. 2 lechis, 2 side posts, and the korah at the top, the cross beam at the top. Lynn in Texas says, the Caravan enclosure reminded me of Circle the Wagons, as in any good cowboy western. I guess some corrals in design create a private enclosure, like for sheep, etc. Right, so I mean, when you think about, it's very interesting. Like, I mean, in the ancient world, were they enclosing entire farms? Did they read that Robert Frost poem thousands of years in advance? Good fences make good neighbors. I'm not sure. The question is, and we saw a little bit when you're talking about out in nature, out in the expanses, in broad spaces, what is going to be an enclosure where we can carry on Shabbos? The rabbis are going to be somewhat negative about that because they don't really want you out there in the field carrying, right? That's definitely feels wrong. So that's why they're creating maximum sizes for these enclosures, right? For the private property. It's no big deal when you're talking about, a city like LA and everybody has like little houses and little yards. Okay, obviously you can carry throughout your property. But, if you live in a place where you have acres of land, it's going to be a much more interesting question. Did you build a proper set of enclosures, of mechitzos around your property so that you could carry something, out of the house and all throughout your property? For sure, it's going to be a case-by-case type of question where you really need to understand the principles and see how they apply at that location. Tom Beck, can you enclose less than the halakhic maximum? Absolutely. Absolutely. So here we have a community Eruv in LA. Not everybody holds by the Eruv. So as we saw yesterday, that Abaye and Rava had this disagreement where Abaye said that, well, look, if there's structures there, and they work as an Eruv, you don't have to announce or say that you're relying on it. It's assumed that you're relying on it as long as it was there before Shabbos. Rava was not into pre-existing structures. And then there was the question, well, what if there was something that people were relying on and it fell, and then you can't use a pre-existing structure that would work anyway, but that would have worked if people had been relying on it. So here in LA, not everybody holds by the Eruv. A lot of the Chabad community does not hold by the Eruv. Some do, but a lot don't. So people who don't hold by the Eruv, you can recognize them on Shabbos because those are the guys that are wearing their prayer shawl when they go from one place, let's say from one synagogue to another, or from home to synagogue if they can't leave their prayer shawl, their talis at the synagogue. So they're wearing it because they don't want to carry it. Other people who do hold by the Eruv, they might carry keys in their pocket, they might carry a folded prayer shawl, etc. The people who don't hold by the Eruv, some of them will make an Eruv around their property. And so you see from time to time houses around LA where they actually have the sticks at the front two corners of the property where it meets the sidewalk and that fishing line there. And so you know that that's a person who doesn't hold by the community Eruv and has created their own Eruv around their property. And of course, that's going to be much smaller than this 2 beis. James Roth says, when was the rabbinic period? So, that's a good question. The sort of general periods that we look at Jewish history, large periods, we're going to talk about the first temple period, before the temples, of course, when we were in the wilderness, then the 400 years before the first temple, after we entered the Holy Land. Then there's the 70 years of the Babylonian exile, then the second temple period. During the second temple period, the sages started to emerge as an important force. So, Hillel and Shammai lived during the second temple. Even Rabbi Akiva was present when the second temple fell. But it's really after the second temple fell in the year 69 that the role of the rabbis became much more important, because if they didn't, Judaism would have basically ended. Judaism was centered around that temple, and now the temple was gone. So what was Judaism going to look like in the absence of a temple? During those 70 years of the exile, it was very problematic, and a lot of Jews just really lost their way. And then it was thanks to Ezra and Nehemiah when they came back at the beginning of the second temple period, and they really had to, sort of refine what Judaism would be. But there was a temple. There was a second temple. Once the second temple falls, because so now the rabbis are creating rabbinic Judaism. They're not creating something new. The main innovation was we're already praying 3 times a day, but those 3 prayers, the morning, afternoon, and evening prayers, are going to take the place of the morning, afternoon, and evening. Well, there's no evening sacrifice, and that's why there was a question if the evening prayer was obligatory or not. But at any rate, the period of the Tanaim is the rabbis up until the Mishnah is compiled about the year 200. Then the period of the Amoraim is while their Gemara or the Talmud is being compiled. Some say up until about the year 500, 600, more or less, because it was a little bit amorphous when the Talmud closed. And then that's really the rabbinic period. There's always going to be rabbis who are leading us, but in terms of the Tanaim and the Amoraim, it's once the Talmud closes. Then the next 500 years is the Geonim, and then the next 500 years is the period of the Rishonim. So these are the great masters and commentators on the Talmud, the Geonim, the Geonim. So that's the next 500 years, and then the 500 years that starts around Rashi and goes through the medievals up until about 1500, and then from 1500 forward, we're in the period that we're in now, and some people call that the Acharonim. And there's other names for this as well. But really, when you're talking about rabbinic Judaism, what we're saying is the sages who created modern Judaism after the fall of the temple. Stephanie Marie Diaz, the fishing line doesn't work for Sephardis, though. But the more machmir, the more stringent approach of the telephone poles and electric lines and poles does, right? So different communities are going to have different stringencies about what kind of a community Eruv is going to be valid. And in fact, well, enough said about that. And finally, Lucy Rom Johnson says, so if you have a large urban Eruv, could vacant lots or a vacant block be a problem? Yes, exactly, 100%. I was not aware of that, but I just read an article as I've been learning this stuff. It's a huge problem, right? Because in a big city, for sure, you can have an area that's 100 feet by 100 feet, and that is not enclosed, right? It can work if they have a vacant area within the city, but it has some kind of enclosure around it. But then, like, if that enclosure breaks down, suddenly that can invalidate the whole community Eruv. And that's why, the LA Eruv, I mean, they have a budget of something like $120,000 a year that they need in order to keep it up, because they have to have a vehicle that has ladders, like a cherry picker. They need to go around and check the whole Eruv every week. They need to check those interior areas as well. It's like a huge amount of work. And some people would say, well, why are we doing that? So don't carry. Just, only carry things within your house. You don't have to carry in the community. But the Eruv really helps people out, particularly moms. Because a baby stroller is considered a form of carrying. So where there's a community Eruv, so then they can take the baby in the stroller. If there's not a community Eruv, and you have really little kids at home, babies, maybe mom is going to be stuck at home with them on Shabbos. So it's definitely, the concept here isn't to just, find legal loopholes of Torah requirements so that life can be easier. The philosophy here is we want to enjoy Shabbos, right? We want to delight in Shabbos. And so we will definitely study the rules until we really understand them well, so that we can create situations where we can enjoy Shabbos. Another wrinkle of this is people in a wheelchair. Sometimes a person in a wheelchair is considered like he's being carried, and so the Eruv allows the person in the wheelchair to move about freely, particularly if he can't roll it himself. If somebody else has to push the chair for him, that's going to be very problematic without an Eruv. So that's another reason why this is important. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for Daf 17 of Tractate Eruvin. Have a great evening and a beautiful Elul as we're getting ready for Rosh Hashanah. Remember, increase your giving to whatever charitable cause is important for you. Increase your giving this month as we're getting ready for Rosh Hashanah. If you'd like to support our work, our nonprofit, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. We share more Torah with more people around the world than almost any organization, so you know that your tzedakah is going to have a big impact. All the best.